The security logs at Crew Rail Hub recorded the entry at 11:47 p.m. 2 vehicles, no press liaison, no advanced communications team, no photographer. Janet Holloway, depot supervisor, night shift, 14 years at Crew, was standing beside Bay 3 when the doors opened. She had been expecting a routine inspection from the regional safety compliance team, a visit that had been rescheduled twice already and carried the particular administrative weight of something nobody especially wanted to do. She had her clipboard. She had her coffee. She was not expecting this. She recognized him immediately, not because she had prepared for it, because there was no preparation to be done. He was simply there in a dark jacket, no tie, moving through her freight bay with the particular kind of focus that belongs to someone who is not here to be seen but to see. Her first instinct, later described to colleagues as embarrassingly ordinary, was to wonder whether he had come in through the wrong entrance. The word moved through the depot the way all significant information moves through a working rail hub at midnight, not through official channels, not through any announcement, but through the specific human mechanism of one person catching another person's eye across a lit yard and communicating everything with a single look. Within 11 minutes, every worker on the night shift knew. Within 14, 3 separate managers had made phone calls they would later describe in carefully measured terms as precautionary notifications. Richard Graves, Senior Director of Infrastructure Transition at Northern Rail Logistics, was at home in Cheshire when his phone rang. Reports suggest he was not asleep. Reports also suggest that the 11-minute drive from his home to the Crew depot felt considerably longer than usual. William had, by this point, already declined the briefing room. This was the first deviation from any script anyone had mentally prepared. There is a choreography to institutional visits, a sequence so well established that its steps are rarely articulated because they have never needed to be. Visitor arrives. Visitor is guided to prepared space. Prepared space contains prepared people with prepared materials. The visit proceeds along prepared lines. Everyone goes home. William asked, with the particular politeness that carries no room for negotiation, whether he could see the yard first. Holloway, who had recovered from her initial surprise with the efficiency of someone who has supervised the night freight at Crew through 3 ownership changes and 2 signal system overhauls, said yes. She let him out. The green cargo transition had been announced with considerable fanfare approximately 38 months prior. The language of the announcement had been confident, specific, and extensively quoted. Electrified freight corridors, zero-emission locomotive targets, a retraining program for over 4,000 rail workers across 14 major hubs, a revised infrastructure investment schedule that would, by the estimates of 3 separate commission reports, position the United Kingdom among the leading nations in sustainable freight logistics by the end of the decade. The night shift at Crew told a more complicated story. Of the 47 locomotives rostered for service that evening, 31 were diesel, not legacy diesel awaiting decommission, operational diesel. The electrified charging infrastructure along the Northern Freight Corridor had been partially installed. The overhead line equipment visible in sections, interrupted in others, like a sentence that had been abandoned mid-thought. The retraining program, which according to the most recent published progress report had reached 63% completion across the hub network, had at Crew reached something closer to what Tariq Musa, logistics engineer, night shift lead, would later describe in his own words as a good start. Musa had been at Crew for 9 years. He knew the yard the way people know the inside of their own house in the dark, not by looking, but by understanding. He had submitted 3 internal reports in the preceding 18 months flagging the gap between the transition targets as published and the transition progress as experienced. The first report had received an acknowledgement. The second had received a response that addressed several points he had not raised. The third was, as of that evening still pending review. He did not know, when Holloway brought the visitor around the eastern service bay and introductions were made, that any of this was about to become relevant. They stood on the depot floor, the three of them, with the particular quality of light that belongs only to working freight yards at night, halogen and shadow, the smell of steel and weather, the low-frequency hum of machinery that never fully stops. William had been asking questions since he stepped off the briefing room redirect, and they were not the questions anyone had anticipated. Not the broad ones, not the strategic ones, not the questions that begin with in terms of the overall trajectory or looking at the headline figures. The questions were operational, specific, the kind that can only be asked by someone who has already read something other than the headline figures. He asked Musa how many of the rostered locomotives that night were running on the new fuel protocol. Musa looked at him, then at Holloway, then back. Later, those familiar with the exchange would note that what followed was not a long pause. It was a short one, but it had a quality that longer pauses rarely achieve. 4, Musa said, out of 47. He did not elaborate. He did not qualify. He offered the number the way someone offers a number they have been carrying alone for a considerable time and have given up expecting anyone to ask for. William said nothing immediately. He looked down the service bay at the line of locomotives. He looked at them for long enough that Holloway, who had 14 years of reading silences in a freight yard, understood that this particular silence was not uncomfortable. It was deliberate. And the published figure, William said, says 63%. That's the network figure, Musa said, averaged across 14 hubs. Another pause, shorter this time. Which hubs are at target? Musa named 2, both southern, both smaller, both, he noted without particular emphasis, recently refurbished with infrastructure that had been built with the new protocol in mind from the ground up, rather than retrofitted onto existing systems. William nodded. He did not look surprised. This, insiders would later suggest, was perhaps the most telling detail of the entire exchange. Graves arrived at 12:34 a.m. He came through the main administrative entrance, which required a badge scan, and the badge scan created a time-stamped record. And the time-stamped record would later become one of several small factual anchors in the internal review that followed. He was dressed in a way that suggested he had prioritized speed over preparation, which was itself an unusual choice for a man whose professional reputation rested substantially on the quality of his preparation. The dynamic in the service bay shifted in the particular way that dynamics shift when someone arrives who has significant institutional authority and is aware that something has already happened that they were not present for. Graves was courteous. He was fluent. He deployed the vocabulary of strategic transition with the confidence of someone who had deployed it many times in many rooms and found it reliably effective. Phased implementation timelines, supply chain constraints at the European manufacturing level, the complexity of retrofitting heritage infrastructure, the genuine and substantial progress that the headline figures, properly contextualized, represented. William listened. He listened with the full and patient attention of someone who has sat through a great many briefings and has learned to distinguish between the content of what is being said and the purpose of its being said. Then he returned to the question. Not aggressively, not dramatically, with the same quiet specificity he had used with Musa 40 minutes earlier. How many locomotives at Crewe are running the new fuel protocol tonight? Graves began his answer with context. William waited for the context to conclude. Then, with a politeness that had by now acquired a particular quality, something between patience and precision, he asked again. Reports suggest Graves provided the correct number on the second asking. Reports also suggest that the process of arriving at that number took longer than the number itself warranted. William thanked him. He did not move toward the door. There is a specific kind of silence that falls in a professional environment when the gap between reported reality and operational reality has been made visible to someone who has the standing to do something about it. It is not loud. It does not announce itself. It occupies the room the way cold occupies a room, not as an event but as a condition. The workers on the night shift at Crew, those who were close enough to observe and far enough to maintain the respectful distance that the situation had naturally established, would later describe the atmosphere in the Eastern Service Bay between approximately 12:40 a.m. and 1:15 a.m. as the kind of quiet where you become very aware of the machinery still running. Graves spoke. He recalibrated. He introduced additional context about the Department for Transport's revised assessment framework and the role of third-party supply delays in the current implementation schedule. He was not being dishonest, insiders would note. He was being what the institutional environment had over time shaped him to be, a person who had learned to manage upward by managing information, and who was discovering, at 12:47 a.m. in a freight yard in Cheshire, that this particular upward direction had not come prepared for management. It was Holloway who said the thing that no briefing document would ever contain. She said it quietly, to no one in particular, or perhaps to the general air of the service bay, in the way that people who have worked nights for 14 years sometimes make observations that are not quite addressed to anyone, and are therefore somehow addressed to everyone. She said that when the lads on the early shift asked her when the new charging points on Bay 7 were going to be finished, she told them she didn't know, and that she had been telling them that for 8 months, and that they had stopped asking. Nobody responded immediately. The machinery hummed. William looked at Bay 7. The visit had not been spontaneous. This, as it became gradually clear to those piecing together the sequence of events in the days that followed, was the detail that reframed everything that had come before it. The unannounced arrival, the refusal of the briefing room, the specific operational questions, the particular knowledge embedded within those questions. None of it was improvised. It was the endpoint of a process that had been running quietly for several months through channels that were not the standard ones. Reports suggest that William had been receiving ground-level accounts from frontline rail workers and mid-level engineers across the freight network, not through formal submissions, not through any official consultation mechanism, but through the kind of direct and informal communication that institutions rarely account for in their reporting structures, because institutions rarely imagine that the people at their apex are listening to the people at their base, without an intermediary layer translating the information upward. Musa's 3 internal reports, the ones that had received an acknowledgement, a sideways response, and a pending status respectively, had not been among those communications, but the picture they described was consistent with the picture William had already been given. Crew had not been chosen arbitrarily. It had been chosen because it was representative. Because if the gap between reported progress and operational reality existed here, at one of the network's major hubs, it existed structurally. Not as an anomaly, as a condition. The visit was a verification. Those familiar with the sequence would later describe it not as a surprise inspection, but as a closing of an evidentiary loop, a final step in a process of accountability that had been assembled, carefully and without announcement, over months. The night freight at Crew was not the beginning of this story. It was the moment the story became undeniable. By 1:30 a.m., the conversation in the service bay had moved to specifics that were no longer framed as context or strategy, but as questions with expected answers. Timelines for Bay 7. Current contractor status on the Northern Corridor overhead line equipment. The actual retraining completion figure at Crew, site-specific, not network averaged. The process by which ground-level implementation reports were reviewed before being incorporated into the headline progress metrics submitted to the Department for Transport. Graves answered. Some answers came easily. Others required phone calls that were made from the service bay floor at 1 a.m. on a weekday to people who were not expecting to be called. Musa, who had at no point been asked to leave and had at no point offered to, stood near the eastern wall beside a section of overhead line equipment that had been installed, correctly and completely, 6 months ago, and had been waiting since for the connecting section to its south to be completed before it could be brought into service. He had included a note about this specific section in his second internal report. The response to that report had not addressed it. He did not mention this. He did not need to. The equipment was visible. William had looked at it. The look had been the kind that does not require annotation. Holloway, whose night shift had now significantly exceeded its routine operational parameters, had at some point been joined by 2 of her senior yard coordinators, not because they had been summoned, but because the freight yard, like all environments where skilled people work in close proximity, had a gravitational quality when something significant was occurring. They stood at a professional distance. They watched. They were part of the witness. There would be no press statement that night. No photographs were released. The convoy departed Crew Rail Hub at approximately 3:40 a.m. through the same bay doors it had entered, into the same dark and the same quiet, and the security log recorded the exit the way it records all exits, as a timestamp, a gate number, a vehicle count. What followed was not visible in the way that announcements are visible or press conferences are visible or published reports are visible. It moved through the quieter channels, the internal kind. Graves submitted a revised implementation assessment to his board within the week. The language of that assessment differed from previous submissions in ways that were specific and measurable, particularly in its treatment of site-level data versus network-averaged figures, and in its revised timeline projections for infrastructure completion at the northern hubs. Those familiar with the document noted that it read, in certain key passages, as though it had been written by someone who understood that the gap between what was reported and what was real had been seen directly by someone who would remember the difference. Musa's third internal report, the one pending review for 18 months, received a formal response within 10 days. The response addressed the points he had actually raised. A follow-up meeting was scheduled. It occurred. The contractor responsible for the incomplete overhead line equipment on the northern corridor received a revised completion schedule with enforcement clauses that had not appeared in the original contract. Work resumed on the connecting section south of the installed equipment at Crew within 3 weeks. Holloway was asked, through official channels, to contribute to a working group on ground-level implementation reporting. She agreed. She brought her clipboard. She brought her coffee. She said what she knew, plainly and without elaboration, the way she had been saying things in that freight yard for 14 years. There is a version of this story that did not happen. In that version, the visit was announced 3 weeks in advance. A briefing pack was prepared. The locomotives scheduled for display were the 4 running the new fuel protocol. Bay 7's incomplete charging infrastructure was photographed from an angle that emphasized the installed section. The network-averaged figures were presented in a room with good lighting and no smell of diesel, and everyone shook hands, and the press release described meaningful progress, and the photographs showed a prince nodding thoughtfully at a holographic infrastructure map. And nothing changed at Crew, and nothing changed on the northern corridor, and the gap between the reported 63% and the operational 4 out of 47 continued to grow in the space between what institutions say and what they do. That version did not happen because William did not arrive at 11:47 p.m. through an unmarked entrance with no press team and asked to see the yard first. The distinction matters, not because one makes for a better story, though it does, but because the machinery of institutional progress, the real kind, the kind that produces completed charging infrastructure and honest implementation reports and working groups where frontline supervisors sit alongside directors and say what they know, that machinery does not run on announcements. It runs on accountability. And accountability, in its most functional form, is not a published metric or a press release or a strategic transition framework. It is someone showing up at 2 a.m., standing on the actual floor, and asking the same question twice until the answer is the real one. Crew Rail Hub recorded the departure at 3:40 a.m. 2 vehicles, same as the arrival. By the time the first morning freight pulled out of the northern yard at 5:15 a.m., the night shift had already turned over. Holloway filed her incident report, routine, factual, 14 lines, and drove home. Musa finished his shift log, noted the 4 locomotives that had run the new protocol, and submitted it through the standard channel. The standard channel this time was being read differently. That is not a small thing. In the quiet infrastructure of how decisions actually get made, not in the announcements but in the reviews, not in the frameworks but in the follow-up calls made at 1 a.m. from a freight yard floor. It is, in fact, the only thing that matters. The green transition at Crew did not complete that night. It did not complete the following week. Infrastructure of that scale does not complete on the timeline of a single visit, however consequential. But something shifted in the machinery beneath the headlines, in the layer where reported figures meet operational reality and are asked, by someone who will remember the answer, to account for the difference. The logs at Crew show an entry and an exit, 2 vehicles each time, no press. The rest is in the follow-up reports, the revised assessments, the third internal submission that finally received a real reply. And in Holloway's observation, made to the general air of the Eastern Service Bay at 12:47 a.m., that the lads had stopped asking about Bay 7. They started asking again.